Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Grant Martin, and you're watching The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Grant's been on the show before, and I got him back on. We've been talking, Grant, a lot about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and I know we've got to be careful with some of you guys because we can't just talk about opinions and stuff because you're still an active guy. You're a student, but you're also still in the military. But you are a former Green Beret, and you have a lot of experience. And I think what's really interesting about you is what you're studying for your PhD. By the way, you talk about warrior scholars. Here's a guy who's an apex warrior getting the apex degree. I think it's just remarkable. Folks don't realize it's about the military. Like if you go into a brigade or division staff meeting, you're bumping into a bunch of people that have PhDs in their specific field. You know, it's remarkable how educated we all get as warriors.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, even though I do think education is great, it's useful to remain humble. I think the best guys are those that know the best folks that have been educated, are those that know their limitations and remain intellectually humble. In fact, that the guys that the folks that I've run into in academic settings, both in the military and outside the military, that I really look up to are those that are more humble the more education they get. And, I think it's difficult actually to remain humble with all more education because you get caught up in knowing so much and you forget about how much you might not know.
Yeah.
And just a quick correction, I'm not a former Green Beret.
Did I say that? I meant to say you're active.
Yeah. And I might as well real quick, say the ubiquitous line. All of these statements are my own opinion. They are not the position of U.S. Special Operations Command or the Department of Defense.
That's right. And I'm not affiliated with anybody, so I can say what I want without any qualifier. But okay, so one of the things you're talking about here is this inability to be wrong, right? And especially, I'm fascinated by this, and I'm going to have some other people talking about this. Very, 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 very smart people as well. But everybody kind of has their pet thing about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, right? Because we've been studying this for really 70 years, right? And so not only is it a long legacy, it's a multi-generational academic legacy of people saying, this is how this is going to be, this is how all this is. And now all of that's on the line. And there's a lot of integrity being spilled all over the place as we try to, look, it's real confusing trying to figure out who's right, who's wrong, who knows what they're talking about, because it's not gone the way a lot of us thought it was going to go.
And you just reminded me of something. When I was at the Citadel as an undergraduate way back in the 90s, communism fell, the Soviet Union fell, and I remember I was in a class, a Russian class, and at the Citadel, and we those in the political science department, we went up to a conference at the University of South Carolina, up in Columbia, South Carolina. And they had all these Russian experts, all these Soviet experts. And I remember they were so confident in predicting that democracy was going to break out, things were going to be great, the Cold War was over, lots of opportunity to go over there and help Russia become democratic, capitalist, and all these other things. And I remember, young cadet raising my hand and saying, I'm potentially going into the military, and I'm just wondering, these guys yesterday were our sworn enemies. We had nuclear missiles pointing at each other. And now you're saying that you're both surprised at what just happened. It took you all by surprise. You didn't see it coming. And you're convinced that there's nothing but good from here. I'm like, I was saying maybe we should maybe we should be a little bit cautious in our optimism. And my professor kind of said, well, you're talking to some of the smartest people in this field, and he kind of poo-pooed me. And I was just thinking, what a lack of intellectual humility. How can they admit that they were wrong, about what they were expecting the Soviet Union to do, but in the same breath, they were convinced that they could tell us what the future was going to bring. Yeah, applying it to anything really, applying it to COVID, applying it to Iraq, applying it to Afghanistan, applying it to now the Ukraine. And like you just said, it doesn't pay to admit you don't know something. It doesn't pay to not show that I am sure about my convictions in multiple disciplines, whether you're an academic or in the military, foreign policy wise, think tank.
One of the things that we see a lot too in the news is this hyperbole and showing the blown up buildings and look, there's atrocity going on for sure. I mean, Ukraine shouldn't have a foreign country invading it, right? But the one of the things, especially having all you colonels on and the other experts that I've on, we've all said individually, I am not a Russian expert. I am not a Ukrainian expert, right? We are experts in certain things. I'm an expert in the ground truth. You're an expert in special operations, and in other areas we can talk intelligently. But, the tactics, I know how hard it is to be in combat because I've been in so much of it. I know what it's like to not have a shower, not eat good food, and how long and how heavy all that load is on people, especially if you're wondering if you're going to die the next day. And it's just incredibly taxing. Like, think about and this is the thing, audience, but the audience probably doesn't know. When you walk across a major fob that gets mortared every day, you're constantly aware. If a mortar lands now, if I get that incoming, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? You're constantly, every step, you're constantly analyzing what you might do to prevent harm for yourself or your others, and you never know when it's coming. And that's what the Russians are experiencing as they push forward into this fight that isn't going well. I mean, in a fight that doesn't go well, oh my God. So we can talk about the Russian thing, but I think more importantly, and kind of backing up, is when we evaluate these things, critical thought is one of the things in the title of this episode. There's a lot that impacts our ability to understand whether you're a poll ad for a division commander, which is the political advisor, or you're somebody else on the ground. There are so many things that impact how we see these problems. What are your, and that's one of the areas that you're kind of studying. Let's talk a little bit about the influence our own experience and predilection towards certain outcomes. How much does that impact our ability as an organization to do the right thing?
Yeah. And before I jump into that, when you say expert in special operations, I would just throw out, I'm an expert in a very small sliver of special operations, and only in a certain few contexts, really. So, a good friend of mine, an active colonel, recently said on social media, "Be careful about the people that say they're experts." So, I would say I'm maybe not an expert in very much, but I do know a few things. And like you said, I'm not a Russian expert, not a Ukrainian expert. I've never been to the Ukraine. But I can't comment on policy since I'm active duty, and I really can't get into the type of warfare being fought there right now. I do have some experience in planning for those types of operations, but have never been in a battle with tanks shooting at me and that kind of thing, or conventional artillery either going out or coming in. So, but what I have been studying and what I am allowed to talk about is some of the things I've been studying at North Carolina State University as part of their public administration department. One of the things that we study is how organizations, particularly public institutions, like the military or like the State Department, how they learn, how they change, and how they adapt to things. And as part of that, there's a process that groups of people, whether you're in an organization or a group of friends or a church or whatever, there's a process of how these different groups take in information and then try to make sense of the world around them. And so there's a lot of literature out there there's a lot of research that's been done on how organizations do this. And that's what I'd like to get into.
Yeah.
But before I get into that, I would say that as part of that, there's also the psychological aspect. So how do individuals do that? And I'm not an expert in psychology. This individuals will make sense of a situation based on their predilection to do so, and that's coming from their innate characteristics. So the idea is you're born with a set of characteristics, and there's a little bit of discussion on what those characteristics might be. I personally like the 5 personality trait model. I've seen there's like an 8 personality trait model, but the 5 personality trait model basically says that you are born with a certain set of characteristics. One of those is openness to new ideas or new things. Another one is neuroticism. Another one is agreeableness, conscientiousness, and so these types of characteristics you're born with them, and then together those things are your identity, and they define your value. So if you're open to newness or new experiences, you might be more supportive of equality, for instance. And I'm overgeneralizing, but
Right.
that is very important, because then individuals will take in information based on those values, and then they will make sense of the situation again based on those values. And so to critically think at the individual level first takes knowledge of how people take in information and how they're immediately biased about that information, and how they will make sense of the world based on those innate characteristics. So if you don't understand that, it's very difficult to do critical thinking. I would argue, even knowing that, it's still difficult to do critical thinking. In fact, I've seen some research that suggests that the more educated you are, the harder it is for you to do critical thinking, because you just get better at finding information that reinforces what you already believe. So it's that whole idea of being educated in intellectual humility and critical thinking. So that's on the individual side. On the organizational side, or just groups of people side, the process simplified. And there's other ideas out there, but one of the ways that groups of people make sense of the world around them is that there's a already built-in culture in a group of people organization. You take the military, for example. You're familiar with this, and that culture forms the basis of a logic story or a narrative, and that is a very complex thing, but it builds up over time. So, for instance, the Green Berets, we have a motto: "De oppresso libere," to free the oppressed, to liberate the oppressed. And whenever you see another Green Beret, they're always DOL, the abbreviation for De oppresso libere, and that's a part of our identity. And that feeds into how we view the world and how we think about the world and those sorts of things. And it's a very strong thing. It's a requirement for groups of people to have that sort of story that brings everybody together and allows coordination, allows trust, and it allows cooperation. And it's a very powerful thing, but it also blinds us to where that might not be, the best way to view the world in some situations.
Right.
So this is a double-edged sword. So that's really kind of what I wanted to frame for you before we get into the particulars on applying that to the Ukraine.
Well, let me ask you this about that very thing. So if I get smarter, and as the smarter I get, the more I'm in the literature of my own discipline, even, right? You're starting to winnow out diversity for unity of message. And so I can understand that, everybody kind of thinks the same way. And that's why when, like Professor Desmarais, who runs the NAT here in San Diego, right? And he's like, hey, by the way, humans were on the North American continent 100,000 years ago. Here's an elephant. Here are tool marks. Here are tools. Here's like some guy's sack from his sack lunch that day. And this thing dates back to 100,000 years. Well, that unity of thought says that's not possible. It was 10,000 years ago, land bridge, a hole in the iceberg, and people walk down. And what we're finding out is that over and over again, that whole narrative and the entire academic discipline has to like shock itself into accepting something that, it just doesn't follow with what they've all written on and what they've all invested their professional careers in. It's the same thing with like the Carvajal diaries, when the conquistadors, the first ones, went from the west to the east on the river and came out at the other end of the delta. The historical record is that diary, and there are other historical records, and it kind of comes together. But because it didn't follow the science, because the science was kind of behind, now we're just starting to catch up on. There were a lot of people in that basin, and it housed as many people as maybe England did at that time, even though it seems prehistoric and savage. It wasn't. So there is that thing. So I guess my question to you is if you're going to write and read information that kind of supports your base findings, do you also collaborate with people that do the same thing? And does the institution kind of grow out like through, I don't want to say metastasize because that's too negative, but does that spread out as they hire like people? I mean, we always want diversity, but we kind of get stuck after skin color on diversity. We don't think like diversity in any other way, like three-dimensionally think of it. Is that a fair thing? Do institutions and do groups gather based upon these thoughts?
So based on my experience in the military, and I'll throw a little bit of the research as well, it's very, very difficult to balance the need for an organization to all be on the same page, coordinate, cooperate, and go towards some kind of objective that you need to accomplish, and at the same time entertain those rebels, those people that that play that are skeptics, and so it takes a leader or a set of leaders that are okay with people questioning the narrative, to include the parts of the narrative that might challenge the organization's identity, which is again is a double-edged sword, because there's positiveness from that identity, but then if the organization is going to miss something big because they can only think in a certain way that meshes with their identity, then how do you do that? So it's kind of, you've got to have a little bit of those rebels. You've got to have a little bit of people who think differently, and you've got to have some humble leaders that are allowing that to happen, allowing themselves to hear alternative views. But then somehow you've got to keep enough of this conformity or identity or whatever you have that allows the organization to keep going, as opposed to just break apart into chaos. So having seen it tried, it takes some very savvy managers and leaders to do that. It's very difficult. I haven't seen it done really, really well a lot. And I think that goes into what the research says about this as well, which is it's necessary, but it's also a danger. So if everybody turns into a rebel, if everybody's questioning everything, then it's very difficult to have trust. It's very difficult to cooperate. So it's just something that I think some portions of the military have tried different ideas. So one idea was the red team concept, and you'd send people to this red team school at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. They would get taught critical thinking and these sorts of things, and then they would come back and they would maybe form what they would call a red cell for the commander, and their job was to question things and provide the commander with alternative ideas and these sorts of things. Some units were able to do it. I didn't really see it incorporated as often as I would have liked, especially in Afghanistan. I didn't see a lot of the red teaming concepts being put into our decision making. So it's very difficult. I think the research suggests you need them. You need a little bit of both. Yeah. And that balancing act takes a really savvy person or a set of people to do that.
There's a couple things here I want to kind of explore with you on that, because one of the questions I've been asking a lot of people, we always, we kind of default like we need more diversity, right? And again, like it can't just mean skin tone. We have to be better than that on diversity, right? Like, do you have political diversity? No, that's gross. Okay, all right. Well, and we don't really have diversity. But on the other end of the scale, the antonym of diversity really is unity, right? So you have to have that unity, diversity balance. And you said it takes an exceptional leader to do that. And I agree. A lot of what I did was challenge what the unit thought it was doing. Sure, I can go and find you some bombs, that kind of stuff. But if our mission is getting screwed up every day by our own actions, boss wants to know that. And if I'm looking across from the agricultural colonel and I'm like, oh, this guy, every time this guy goes out, I'm going to go see what they're doing because I know they're screwed up. That's going to make me a maverick. And and it has happened. It's gotten me kicked off of camps and it's gotten me killed in the staff room. Right. So I need that commander to protect this maverick so I can go out and get what they want, because full colonels getting pissed off and wanting somebody out of theater usually get their way, right? And so I've got to have a leader on my team. I've got to have a commander that I work for that value what I do, but I can't be so contrarian. I can't be so outside the staff process that I'm expendable.
Yeah. I would tell junior officers that were or NCOs that were struggling with the bureaucracy or with the commander that just didn't want to hear any alternatives, any alternative thinking, that number one, they had to pick their fights. If they were seen as always being that person that they would just lose influence. But then the second thing was that they really had to figure out a way to be influential. And so, if the place to not be influential was the conference room, because, and you've seen it, I'm sure, they don't air dirty laundry a lot of times in public. So if you go into the conference room and you have a meeting and nobody's saying anything bad or nobody's contradicting the commander, then that's not a safe place. So why even try? You've got to figure out some other way to be influential. And one option is to throw up your hands and be frustrated. And a lot of guys would do that, and some would get out. And I would say, you could view it that way, or you could see it as an opportunity. How can I figure out a different way to influence the commander? What are the ways that he's getting influenced or she's getting influenced? And that could allow for a lot more, productive time. And a lot of people just don't do that. They don't want to take that extra step and say, okay, yeah, you'd think that everything should run great, but I know you were involved a little bit, and you know how I was involved with the evacuation of folks from Afghanistan. And, there was a lot of people banging their heads against the bureaucracy that had been set in place and was very difficult to change. Some of it was legal. And so, you could bang your head against the wall that couldn't get, a visa or a passport or, whatever. Or you could figure out, okay, based on the situation, how do we best help some of these people get on a plane and get out? And that the people that were banging their head and getting frustrated were not they were right, but they weren't winning.
Yeah, I want to clarify some things because I don't know if we know so much about the staff process because we've done it, and there's so many things that we just know. One of the things that happens in a staff room, there can be 50 people in this room. Maybe it's 20, depending on the size of the unit and depending on who's there. But there'll be civilians involved. There'll be military people. There'll be NCOs who are significantly lower ranking than, say, a colonel, who's the next step up for him is to be a general. So you have this wildly disparate group of people, and they sit almost in concentric rings, around a table. And the closer to you are, if you're at the table, you're one of the commander's main people, right? You've got a job. It's like, this is the person for this job. And then out that are all the experts and subordinate people. And so if you were to kick in a question from the back row, which is usually where I kind of sat, there's a lot of rejection of that instantly. It's like, doesn't that guy know he's not supposed to talk in this meeting, right? And you're like, so what I learned to do was I'd raise my hand. And then even if I wasn't part of this unit, I was just popping into town to like, hey, Pete, go in and check out this meeting and see what you think. If I'm in this meeting, then I'm going to participate if it's appropriate. So I raise my hand and I would say something like, hey, sir, I just, if this is the kind of meeting that we can contribute and be candid, then great. If not, I'm just going to be quiet and observe. And then you're smiling because like the commander's like, what? Well, we're always committed around here, and then like, all right, well then I'm just going to say this, and then one of the times I did this, we had this whole conversation about, the Iraqis and leaving a legacy. We wanted to know if we were going to advise the general to build a freedom tower. And then I just, said my thing. Then I said, has anyone asked the local Iraqi governor? Like, does anyone talk to him about this? Is this on his list of things to do? And then you could have heard a pin drop, because they had just done bashing this guy and saying, we're going to tell this guy what to do. The ambassador's coming, and then we'll just tell Muhammad, get out of the way or whatever. And I'm like, I could hear this problematic mindset. That's why I spoke up. And I didn't say anything about those things. I just said, has anybody asked this guy what he needs done? Right. And this is late in the game. We're leaving. And so I left my little hand grenade, which I learned from you guys, the Green Berets, but you guys are super tactical, candid, honest, hard questions. And then, I just shut up the rest of the meeting. And then during chow, which is immediately after, all these captains and colonels come up and like, man, thanks for asking that question. We needed more of that, but only because I knew how to sit in that blind and sharpshoot one time. I picked one fight. I asked for permission to say it. Did I survive that? If I did that every day in that meeting, I wouldn't be invited back to those meetings.
Yeah. And very few meetings have I been in where that is actually the forum to bring up issues. So,
right.
Most organizations I've been a part of, there are other venues that you're supposed to do that. The meeting is more of a ritual. My buddy likes to call them, my buddy Ben Zwabelson likes to call them ritual rain dances. So, we do certain things in the military as performance. It doesn't really result in much beyond, we have these rituals, right? And they mean symbolic things. And again, for whatever reason, the organization needs some of those things.
Yeah.
A collective bringing together and patting each other on the back. It serves some purposes, I guess. But you got to know your organization. You can't conflate those with especially if you're talking about how do we make sense of a situation. And so, talking about the Ukraine, and I mentioned this to you, I think last time we spoke, which is I've seen three ways of making sense of Ukraine, which are fascinating to me. And there's probably more out there. In fact, you could probably come up with some as well. But the three that I've seen, the first one is historical analogy.
Right. So,
finding something like, this is exactly like the beginning of World War II. Neville Chamberlain is about to give up, Europe to Hitler, and we got to do something about it. Or this is Soviet Russia or Tsarist Russia or whatever. There's some kind of historical analogy, which is the easy button. A lot of guys in the military like to use it because we study military history, so it's relatively easy to grab an example and say, look, and then the implication being you don't want to repeat whatever mistakes were made back then. The second theme I've seen to make sense of the Ukraine is what our buddy Joshua Trevino introduced me to, which was the idea of applying cancel culture to foreign policy. So,
right.
This is exactly like, Putin is exactly like, some actor who messed up and put something on social media that he wasn't supposed to, or she wasn't supposed to, and now we've got to cancel that person, especially if that person doesn't apologize. And then anybody associating themselves or doing business with that person needs to be shamed and canceled as well. And so, you see it with, we're gonna do, all these companies aren't even going to do business in Russia anymore. McDonald's just, I think, closed all their stores, and all these, I think it was Adidas recently said they're going to stop selling things or making things there. And so, it's kind of this idea of we're going to cancel them. We're going to make it so hard for them to exist that it'll stop their bad behavior or whatever. And the danger with that one is that it's an intuitive sort of logic being applied. It's kind of knee jerk. It's not a lot of thinking going on. And if we're talking about critical thinking, the thing I've heard recently is we're gonna stop buying Russian oil. Well, is that seems intuitive. It seems like a logical thing. Why would we be doing that? But if the result of that means that Russia doesn't change their operations and gas prices go up for us, if that's all that happens, then other than it being a performative thing or we feel good about ourselves, is that actually good? Could that actually be bad for us? Could Russia actually benefit from it? Get actually more money from the price of oil going up? So, a lot of this logic when you're just canceling, to me seems to be potentially counterproductive, and just not a lot of critical thinking going on. The third thing that I've seen, the third kind of logic that I've seen used with respect to the Ukraine situation is what I would say I've seen more on the right side of the political spectrum, but the far left is actually using this as well, and that's this notion where you're skeptical of anything that the elites or the media are putting out. So this idea that Russia's doing something bad, but because the mainstream media and the elites have really quickly jumped on the side of criticizing Russia, then something must be up. We must not know everything that's going on. Right. So initially that sounds good to a critical thinker. You want to be skeptical, but then a lot of these folks are then going right to their normal knee-jerk way of viewing things, and maybe they're turning to their favorite conspiracy to explain things or whatever. And it's curious because I've heard it from the far left too. So on the far left, you've got like whataboutism, which is, well, yeah, Russia's bad, but guess what? We're bad too. So maybe we shouldn't do we definitely shouldn't do anything militarily. We shouldn't, but we also shouldn't punish the Russian people because we don't want to make them suffer. So we can only make the oligarchs and Putin suffer because we're bad. So again, initially skepticism about the mainstream narrative, but then a knee-jerk, intuitive sort of falling back into your favored, policy or whatever. Right. Even to the extent that Nicole Hannah-Jones has said that, media coverage about Ukraine is racist. Well, why? Well, she's skeptical initially against mainstream media, which is good critical thinking. But then she goes right into her favored critical race theory narrative, which is everything's racism. Well, if you're looking for racism, everything being racist, then you're going to find it. So it's really interesting. Those three themes, a lot of people and even groups of people are really quickly jumping to those to make sense of the situation. And I think the key is, we need critical thinkers. We need the populace to be critical thinkers to allow our politicians and leaders to take a step back and say, okay, do we really want to knee-jerk respond,
right,
or be attracted to one kind of explanation, and then make a decision and not think it through? And so each one of those has parts of their theme are accurate, but they're also problematic, especially if you fall back on some shaky logic. So those are three things. I don't know if you've seen other things out there that people are really quick to jump on and say, okay, well, this explains everything that's going on in Ukraine to me.
I feel like there's a mirror for each one of those things too. Just probably the most clearly thing, like, look, I'm guilty of this, right? I typically don't trust the media, in part because I'm like, well, that picture's from 2017. That picture's of the same BMP from 4 different sides. You're talking about we had Chuck Holton on the show, and he's in Kyiv. I don't know if he's in Kyiv today, but he's in Kyiv, and he's like, yeah, these guys are reporting loud explosions. And I'm like, yeah, but Chuck, you and I know that these sounds have a meaning, and you can transition. Like, you could say, okay, that is outgoing, that's incoming, that's small arms fire, that's a kilometer away, that's no big deal. That matter of fact, it's just a small arm, this is not a big thing. But it is true that the media does struggle to get these things right, because look, and these super famous field reporters, I've met some of these folks. They're absolutely clueless as to what's going on, right? So I am critical with that, but I'm also guilty of having this bias of just not accepting what they say is true, because I think they've got commercial motives, if nothing else, if not political motives. And then the other thing I want to say about, when we look at these three things, when I like to use Murray's law, and it's one of the things that I've transcribed into like one of my laws of what I do. When the government says it's going to do X to accomplish this value, they're going to accomplish the opposite of that. So when you hit Russia with sanctions on and don't buy their fuel, you're just going to benefit them and make them have more fuel or more money for fuel or whatever it is. I mean, these things don't ever work the way these brilliant people think it's going to work. And so ultimately, I just assume that we're net destabilizers when we get involved in these things because we don't have the ability to do that. Now, that's me being unfair to a lot of people, but I've also seen our performances and how, look, brilliant people. And I always mock the Kennedy School of Government because as soon as one of those people show up in a combat zone, I'm like, here is Mr. or Mrs. Irrelevant. They literally don't know what they're doing. Am I being unfair? Am I not using my critical thought? I'm just using my experience as to like what they say is happening. And then I go out and I'm like, can I find a result from this? And they don't. They literally don't ever. They just run their mouth and they never have any accountability for when they're wrong or desire to check themselves.
No, I'd say two thoughts. The first one being, I guess there is a little bit of a debate on are the leaders, the bureaucrats, the politicians, are they just reacting to the populace? And so you could argue, well, if the populace aren't thinking critically, and they're going to punish you if you try to be a critical thinker, you try to do something counterintuitive, like, well, yeah, we doesn't look good for us to be importing Russian oil right now, but let's think about this. If the populace is going to punish you for even starting out words like that, then what are you going to do? You're going to get voted out of office anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I think it's a little bit of both. I think leaders can lead. If you can communicate well. Reagan was supposedly a great communicator. If you can articulate well what the argument is for or against a certain policy, then I think that also can create the political space for you to do what you want to do. So I think it's a little bit of both. And you're right. The bureaucrats, sometimes they have their own agenda too, right? And so you'd like everybody to be, at least a little bit schooled up on critical thinking and to be humble and not knee-jerk, jump into whatever preferred narrative or explanation they want. So I guess the second thought is, it's great to be skeptical about the mainstream media or any report that you get. So even if it's not mainstream media, if it's the one source that you love, then you've got to be skeptical about that one source. So, I've got a friend that he only reads far right conspiracy stuff, and he's always sending this stuff to me, and especially about the military, and he'll ask me, well, do you know about this? And I'm like, well, this is not right. I can tell you 100% it's not right. But so that's kind of the second piece is, yes, be skeptical about whatever's out there, no matter where it's coming from. Be skeptical. I would say you don't have to be skeptical towards sources that have over time consistently shown you that they are not going to feed you what you want to hear. Very difficult to do that, I would say, for most people. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that source is always going to be right. But anyway, that initial skepticism, I think, is good. But then I think the second step for a critical thinker is be skeptical about what you knee-jerk go into easily. So if you're skeptical about the whatever report you're getting, you're going to naturally want to go, okay, this is the way I make sense of the world. These are my preferred values. This is the frame that I see things through. All right, now I'm going to make sense of the world. Well, wait a minute. Now you need to be skeptical about yourself, and either individually or organizationally. So if your organization, has that same sort of thing, you'd like to have something in place that allows for the commander, if you're in a military organization, or the leader or whatever, or the group to be able to hear, some alternatives, just to do that check on, well, we prefer to hear or believe these things. And, we're probably going to miss something. So what else is out there?
Yeah. When you look at these, the situation is so challenging because it's not our fight. I mean, ultimately, right? Like we have this role in the world. We have this role with NATO. We have this role of being, the watchdog for everybody. We're sort of the stalwart against Russian aggression, all these things. Ultimately, not our fight, especially after we just and I'll say this, you don't see anything about it. We just bungled the departure from Afghanistan and left our allies absolutely in the lurch after we convinced them to go there with us. And now we're like, hey, we're going over here. We must, my opinion, we must seem like drunken sailors seeing a piece of ass and just going after any kind of fight we can find. The world has to look at us and just go, you guys are bananas. What are you guys doing? But then again, if we don't do it, who does? And then if we do it and we cancel everything about Russia to include their opera singers that have nothing to do with foreign policy, how do we dust off Russia and let them get back to some form of normal? And I'm not asking you policy questions, but in terms of thinking about this critically, how do we balance all this stuff where, like, do we even need to be there? And what if we punish Russia, which is punishing the Russian people ultimately, right? I mean, okay, you punish an oligarch. Where do they get their money from? These lower level people. If they can't buy Big Macs, you're not hurting Vladimir. You're hurting some dude that's like, I fucking live on Big Macs. That's all I can afford, right? So we have these things where we have an assumption that somehow canceling folks is going to be the answer. But at some point, they get to exist in the world again. There's going to be a Russia in a couple of years, and it might be a different form. It might have slightly different boundaries, but chances are we're going to go back to something that fairly closely represents the status quo of today. So how do we critically think ourselves through these maze of problems with this thing? Like, should we be involved? How much involved? How badly can we destroy Russia? And I say we, I mean the world community.
You just reminded me of a story I recently read that as part of the canceling of Russians, we canceled a Russian, I think he was a reporter who had been reporting, basically as honest as he could about the situation, and was not pro-Russia at all. And so he kind of got caught up just because he's Russian. He got caught up in the cancel culture, which is, that's sort of the same thing that happens. I've seen, in the U.S. where, well, there's a person that might be on your political side, but they slip up or something, and so they get canceled. Well, that's actually, hurting that political group by doing that. So, again, if we're in a democratic republic and we rely on the citizenry to be critical thinkers, then the question becomes, well, how do we get people to be critical thinkers? And I think on the one hand, our leaders can't encourage people to be non-critical thinkers, so that they have that responsibility to not encourage it, not and you can get punished for not encouraging, right? And then the second piece is education. We've got to somehow value critical thinking, which is not critical theory, not to conflate it with that, but how do we introduce to people, even in high school, but definitely in the universities, that, hey, you may study this one topic and you maybe come out of it an expert. But there's something more important than all of that, which is if you go back 10, 20, 50 years, the person that was schooled in that same discipline back then was not schooled 100% in everything being totally 100% correct.
Right.
There's been advancements in that discipline since then, and you now have the benefit of that. But guess what? In 10, 20, 50 years, there's going to be some advancements. So you don't know everything, and you need to be open to learning. that the idea that in fact, I think it was Harari, the guy that wrote Sapiens, the book Sapiens.
Yeah.
He said in the future, they were asking him, what do we need to be telling kids in school these days? What do they need to be studying? Do they need to be studying computer science or AI or whatever? And he said philosophy was one big thing that he thought was going to be in need. But he said the second thing was there will never be an end to learning. You will have to constantly learn throughout your life. You can't just go get a degree or a specialty or whatever and then go to work, because you will be out of a job in 20, 30, 40 years. If you don't have that idea, that culture of I have to constantly educate myself because things are going to be changing so fast that whatever I learned last year is going to be obsolete. If you don't have that, so I think that applies across the board. Not just he was specifically talking about the changes in technology and AI and these sorts of things, but if you are in the political science spectrum, if you are giving advice, if you work for the State Department, the military, U.S. European Command, NATO, if you don't have that mentality already, then you're behind the power curve. And I would argue that it's very difficult. It's very rare to see, that type of culture, because again, if you're going to play the hierarchy game and you want to move up the hierarchy, you're not necessarily going to get promoted if you say, all right, folks, I'm not really sure I know what's going on.
Right.
In my entire career, I've seen a lot of new generals and colonels come into jobs, and they give that first "here's me" kind of thing. In my entire career, 24 years, I've only seen one person, and multiple. Every 2 years we get new commanders, right? So 12 or more, at every level. So multiple, more than just 12, but 12 times in my career I've seen new commanders come and go. Only one time have I seen a commander say, hey, I'm not really sure what's going on or how to understand certain things. Yeah. Now, I have heard it said after the fact. So, I'm sure you can remember who said this, but there have been some generals who said, we don't know what's going on in Afghanistan after the fact, right?
Yeah. All the rest of them are turning that corner. We turned the corner. I think you posted something in our group that we're in, all these quotes from all these generals. It's a great thing. One of my big beliefs is that in modern combat, affect beats effect. And we're seeing a lot of that attempt here. And because the battle is not just what's in front of the tank, it's these geopolitical things and everything else. The cancel culture thing is a powerful affect machine, right? I don't like Russia. And so you cancel whatever opera singers. You don't call them Moscow. I literally made a joke about Moscow mules, and I actually saw it in writing somewhere that we were going to call it, the Kiev, kerfluffle or something. So
I think they're pouring Russian vodka out in the streets or something.
Yeah.
Actually, you know what? They're probably pouring out all vodka because they assume all vodka.
Right. Exactly. Especially if it's got
Do you remember when people stopped buying Corona beer?
Yes.
At the beginning of COVID.
Yes. Yeah. Like not the same thing. So, but these are affect driven things, right? Like this action creates an emotional response to the stimuli, right? And so we're trying to perform these things to get these reactions. Like, yes, let's go. We didn't care about Ukraine 2 years ago. Didn't care about them 18 months ago. Not as a nation. We weren't with Ukraine. Now all of a sudden we're with them. Give us another 6 months or a year or two, whatever it's going to be. We're not going to be with Ukraine then either. We're just going to move on to the next thing. We're just getting hit with these emotional triggers that make us want to, I don't want to buy, Petronas gas. Is that from Russia? Am I good with that? Is that the right behavior? It's this performative thing, and it's as far from critical thinking as you can be, but it's so powerful compared to the actual things we need to work on, the actual affects we would need to create. I think that the number one affect would be, can you get Putin to want to stop? And what does that take? Is it canceling money? Maybe. Is it lining up 3,000 Russians outside of his door, knocking very vigorously on the door saying, stop? Probably for me, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, that would be a better affect driving machine where it'd be like, because you and I both know you put 2,000 Russians willing to die to go towards the Kremlin or wherever they are, and carry him out like Ceausescu, he's going to either change his behavior or end up dead, right? That's the affect that we need to create to make this thing stop. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on modern conflict and multinational conflict and critical thought with all of these things? If we're going to focus on an affect thing, why are we just canceling things? It doesn't make sense.
And I think the way foreign policy is made today is probably a little bit different than it was, even 10, 20 years ago. But, I do have friends that listen to, maybe one news source, and then they hear we're buying Russian oil. Well, why are we buying Russian oil? It makes no sense. So they will then jump onto social media and either put a post on social media, or usually it's forwarding somebody else's. That's emotional appeal to immediately stop buying Russian oil. And so I try to talk to my friends and say, maybe number one, you shouldn't be just looking at that one source of news. That usually doesn't go over too well. But then the second piece is, hey, instead of running over to social media and just sending that out, which multiplied by everybody has an influence on our elected leaders, and they have to. They have to look at what everybody, or at least the Twitter sphere or whatever, is saying, because if they don't, it's potentially could get them punished. And so just those little micro behaviors, I think that's one piece. And so if any of my friends are knee-jerk reacting, posting stuff to Facebook or posting something to social media that has, there's no thought in it, maybe it's intuitive, but there's counterintuitiveness all throughout, policy and foreign policy. Then at the least, I try to privately, because publicly usually doesn't work, privately say, hey, have you thought about this? What if this results in X, Y, and Z, and none of those three are good for us, and two of them are good for the other side. That little part that I just played, if we could multiply that, and if everybody could kind of do that, then I think you could potentially change some of this. And at least, if one person, if I know 100 people and one person that does that kind of thing, and one person changes their behavior, then hey, that's one less person out there that's doing that kind of thing. And I think that's important, because ultimately it's one person that starts a lot of these things, or one person, repeating, and then 10 people see it and it just grows. But I think at the organizational level, so if you are and I hate to say bureaucrat, but I'm a bureaucrat. I sit at a desk and forward emails a lot. But if you're part of the bureaucracy, if you're part of whether you're military, State Department, all the think tanks that have to deal with Congress, if you're a congressional staffer, if you're anyone that touches the Ukraine situation or any kind of foreign policy thing, and that could be huge, right? I mean, that could be anybody dealing in the economic world, in corporations, et cetera. If you have a chance to influence the way your organization hears information in different ways, whether you're a leader that just needs to be a little bit more welcome to alternative ideas and encourage different narratives, or you're just a person that needs to figure out how to best get those alternative narratives up to your leaders, I think that's huge. I think there's a huge part to play for the people like myself that are just pawns in the massive machine of the bureaucracy. We can't be lazy and just complacent and just go with the flow. And that doesn't mean you have to rebel at every little situation and throw your hand up and point out the emperor has no clothes at every situation. But you do have to figure out, I think, if you especially if you've raised your hand and sworn, an oath, I think you owe it to the populace, to the country, to figure out how do you go about influencing your organization, knowing that you're not going to be successful every time. But if you can influence your organization to think a little bit more critically, to think through some of those counterintuitive things. Well, if we do this, it sounds like we're going to get the, as you say, effect that you want. But is that actually second, third order down the line, long term? Is that really what we think is going to happen? And maybe we're measuring the wrong thing. That sort of thing. And again, to me, it's this base idea of humility. It's intellectual humility. One of my favorite professors at NC State, Dr. Garson. I mean, he taught us probably more about the limitations of statistics than he did about the actual statistical methods. And I thought that was huge. I mean, a huge education for me was learning that there's all these limitations to these statistical methods. And that's huge. And if you don't understand the limitations of whatever it is you're dealing with, whatever your organization, whatever methods your organization works with on a daily basis, if you don't understand those limitations, you don't ever question, if you don't understand alternatives, then to me, you're just a lazy, complacent bureaucrat. You're like the worst scum on earth. There's a special place in the seventh level of hell for you, and you and you go away.
I know it's sort of backwards, but I thought we might take a minute and talk a little bit about specifically. People could say common sense and critical thinking all the time, like you're talking about flapjacks and syrup. Like there's no depth in it, right? So let's talk a little bit in depth as we close up about critical thinking, and then maybe what are some hallmarks when you're like, oh, I should pay attention here because this is what Grant suggested was an indicator that we're not doing critical thinking. Because I think that's one of the things you develop. You develop a savvy for like, civil affairs has said 1 + 2 = banana. And you're like, I haven't seen a banana anywhere at all. Right. And so we're trying to sort through these things and to develop some critical thinking. So what are some triggers? And then how would you define critical thought for a person in an organization?
So to me, you're right. When I hear critical thinking a lot, especially in the military, it's usually just, it's a lot of times undefined, or they'll say something along the lines of think about ends, ways, means, linkage. So you got to linearly link your what you'd like to accomplish with whatever it is, whatever tool you're using. To me, critical thinking is more along the lines of what Donald Shern and Chris Aguirre and some others have talked about, which is you're not just questioning what it is you're doing. You're not just saying, "Am I doing the right thing?" You're questioning, "Why am I doing what I'm doing?" So they like to talk about second order learning or third order learning, double loop learning, triple loop learning. And so the first step would be to say, all right, I'm doing X. Is X working? That's kind of like the first order. But then you say, well, wait a minute. Why am I doing X? That's kind of like the second level. And then the third level is, why am I thinking about that second order in the way that I'm thinking? So you're being critical about the way you're thinking. And so that's kind of like, to me, the essence of critical thinking is you're not just thinking about why you're doing what you're doing. You're thinking about why you're thinking in the way that you're thinking about why why you're doing what you're doing. So it's a question. If you're an academic, you're looking at what they call epistemological and ontological questioning. So what are your assumptions about how the world works? What are your assumptions about how knowledge is gained? In the more practical world, I would say it's just thinking about how you learn and the assumptions that are built in that you never really question about your feedback loops. And if your feedback loops, and I know you've seen this, are performance driven,
Right.
That's and a lot of them, even though we might call them measures of effectiveness, they're really just another level of performance. And so if you don't have some way of questioning the way you learn and questioning actually how you learn, not just we need to learn, then I think that critical thinking is just not happening.
I would even push even further in that measure of performance and call it a measure of performance. Like you're performing the task. It's not like an actual, like, did this work? Like we build a government in Afghanistan. Okay, well, can you get a weapons request to go up and down the pyramid and back over to the person that needs the request satisfied? No, you cannot. Well, then this is all the performance. We don't actually have a government here that functions in a way that they can reliably make provisions show up to a place on the side of a mountain with nothing, So these performative things, it's crucial to understand. And one of the reasons why I was just so successful, and this may not be super sexy spy stuff, but I would see the briefing on the wall of all the things we had done, and I'm like, but did any of it work? Like what happened? And we don't have that critical thinking note. I don't know if it's 1, 2, or 3, or maybe it's an overriding or dividing thing. But hey, Pete self-tasks, go out and go see what happened after that goat inoculation operation. Go ask 2 days, a week later, and see what happened here. And then you find out the most incredible things, because what you believe inside what I call the spaceship, and everybody's all talking to themselves about all the things they're doing, and they're showing each other all these slides. I'm like, I'm just going to go ask the Afghans what's going on. And you're shocked at like the complete lack of reality in all of this critical thought. Like everything's based on an assumption. It's like it's an intel guy writing in IR, like information requests, questions for that you want a guy like me to go answer, right? And when you write them in a conference room, yeah, okay, you're adorable. When are we going to get blown up? Okay, I'll find that out for you. But most of the questions you can't even think of because you can't comprehend the reality that's out there. And when you think about,
if you don't have anybody in the background asking why are we doing those things,
right, and it's all
I'll never forget the commander coming to visit us once in Afghanistan and asking why do we have a team in a certain location. And the answer back was, well, they replaced the team. They're there because that's where the team they replaced was. And the commander said, well, so there's no real logic guiding why that team is there and what they're doing.
Right.
I'm going to come back in a few months and I want you to tell me, how they're tied into the overarching. But if you don't have anybody saying why.
Right. The other thing too, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but I think we're at the heart of this thing. You look at the map of Afghanistan. We won't talk about Ukraine because I don't want to get you in trouble. But when you look at the map and you're in the district, you're in the provincial center, and you're like, you see grayed out districts. These are counties that don't exist on the map, but they're there because they physically exist. And you say, well, what's going on up there now? Well, we can't go there. So at some point, what we're doing stops. And so where does it begin? Oh, well, there's an SF team out there training what they call the ALP, whatever. Yeah, but that's not governance. That's SF dudes training people to be able to defend themselves. Is there governance there? Let's go there. Let's not just say, well, there's SF guys there, so it's working. And all of a sudden you realize that like the map gets really small on where the government is. And any commander should be like, mind is blown. What are we doing?
You just reminded me of a meme I've seen recently that has a changing narrative of Ukraine, and it starts with, Russia's going to win in one day or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the next, like a few days later, oh, well, Russia's got some problems, but they're going to win. And then it's Ukraine is fighting pretty well. And then like the last one was Ukraine's fighting real well because the Western nations trained them really well. And I was thinking, well, we trained the Afghans as well. So what's the difference?
Yeah. Well, I've heard that too. Like, well, the Ukrainians want it more. No. Yeah, maybe they want it more in this fashion. The Afghans are just better at, hey, you're my friend. Now you're my friend. Like that's how they've survived. It's not cowardice, it's survival. And if you look at it in a one-dimensional way, you've not done the critical thinking to understand the Afghan way of thinking. When their peers are unhappy, underfed, feel unsafe, then you don't have an organization that you believe you have. No matter how many briefing slides are out there that say the opposite is true, you know that one mountain over, one squad over, one hill over, these guys are starving and there's no support. So why are you going to think the people there have support? They're not going to.
Right. Yeah. And my pitch to you and your listeners is, if we want to have some critical thinking, that knee-jerk initial response has to be part of the thing you don't do.
Right.
And so, whether it's, and again, the more educated, the more experienced you are, the more difficult it is to do that. So you would have guys in a certain, they've multiple rotations into a certain area in Afghanistan, in the case of, for me and for you as well. And you can't tell them anything, because guess what? They've been there. And I recently have had a commander that came back from Iraq, so like in the last couple few years, everything, he wanted to rewrite all the doctrine based on his experience in Iraq, his 1 year in Iraq.
Yeah.
And, so that's kind of like the extreme example of no humility. I mean, no, you've got it all figured out based on that one experience, and we're going to apply it from then on to everything.
I love it. And I thank you for coming on, man. It's I know it's a lot of your time, but it's just so fascinating to be able to talk to someone that's thinking about these things at the levels above everything, like organizational and critical thinking, and how to keep yourself out of these feedback loops. It's something that we all need to hear. And we didn't even get a chance to talk about how exceptional a leader would be to be able to manage the kind of animal house it takes to balance your diversity and your unity of effort, and still be like, I'm going to send Pete out to go cause whatever ruckus he can, because we can take it, because we want to get things right. Boy, that takes an incredible person to be able to do that. And there's a reason why a guy like T.S. Eliot struggles, because not T.S. Eliot, God damn it, who am I thinking of?
Lawrence.
Yeah, Lawrence. Yeah, Lawrence.
T. Lawrence.
Yeah. T. Lawrence. T.S. Eliot. T. Lawrence, and his ability to go out. Well, he never came back and built trust with the home, and so he shows up out of the blue, all tan, out of uniform. Of course, you're not part of what they're going to do, and of course, you have no influence. You have influence with the wrong. You have to have influence on both sides to be able to fix these things, and that example plays out over and over and over again with what we do and how we fail as an institution to pick the right fights and actually come back with wins. All right, let me wrap this thing up. Oh, Shot called me up. Thanks, man. T.E. Lawrence, you got it right. All right, stand by.